From missiles to longbows, machine guns to swords, inventing ways to kill each other is as old as time.
Charge for horse!
And developing better ways to bump each other off seems to be the mother of invention. But which weapons are the best? The greatest ever has shot a candle like a bullet, boomeranged a melon, and crushed a gun with a Humvee, all in the search to find the best weapon for the individual combatant. We canvass some of the world's most respected weapons experts for their top 10 instruments of destruction. They include Tom Clancy, world-class novelist and military observer.
Well, it beats being hit with a knitting needle, but the smaller the hole it makes, the less likely it is to kill you.
Robert Hardy, Shakespearean actor, longbow expert.
If the man was in range, they could pop an arrow in while he was gulping air.
And Royal Armoury's hard man, Martin Pegler.
Feeling lucky, punk?
Right in the middle.
To qualify for the greatest ever, the weapon must deliver maximum damage for minimum training and demonstrate a global impact. Take cover, the greatest ever weapons. Coming in at number 10 on our list is the 5-foot-long slicing sword that was the centerpiece of an entire warrior class for 1,000 years. If you were a Japanese samurai, you were as good as naked without your katana.
The katana is the classic samurai sword, the sword that we associate with this almost mythical warrior from the East.
It's a slicing weapon. It's designed for removal of limbs, removal of heads. These swords are perfectly capable of cutting a man from his neck right the way down through his body to his groin with a single blow.
The characteristic curved, single-edged blade of the katana first appeared around 900 AD. And in the hands of the samurai, this sword came to represent the essence of the warrior mindset, an instrument of violence and martial philosophy.
Hand-to-hand combat with edged weapon is the most absolute of human conflict. The lessons learned here raise the human consciousness to its highest level because it's the most demanding and there's the most at stake, your life.
James Williams teaches samurai skills to the modern military. He invited the greatest ever to experience some of the secrets of the katana.
What we're cutting then are woven mats that we soak with water to give them the density and the weight for proper cutting. In feudal Japan, they cut people instead. Prisoners were cut all the time. They used them to test the swords to see the impact it had on tissue and bone.
The anatomy of the katana begins and ends with the blade.
What you have is a slightly curved shape which facilitates the blade spending a long time in the cut. It's essential for that to happen because the longer the blade spends in the cut, the deeper it will cut. A large number of the cuts in the repertoire of the samurai were designed to be using the last 4 or 5 inches of the sword. By only going 2 to 5 inches into the body when you make a cut and still get your sword back when you're using it. First cut would be hitting the front of the head, hit just above
Wooden
the
swords
eye.
called bokken are often used when practicing, much less messy.
And a very common one was to strike the clavicle. This would sever the subclavicular artery, split the ribs and puncture the lung, and then cut through the sternum, open the front of the heart, and the sword would cut its way out so that I could use it immediately.
There is sophisticated technology behind the katana's performance.
You want the sword to be sharp and to maintain its sharp edge. And for that, you need a hard material. But at the same time, hard materials tend to be brittle. The great thing about the katana is that it manages to combine hardness with what's called fracture toughness.
Steel gets its strength by adding carbon to ordinary iron. But to create a top-quality steel, it's essential to have the carbon evenly distributed. This is done by hammering and folding the steel hundreds of times. But the really clever part is the heat treatment of the resulting blade. By coating the blade with clay, the rate of cooling is controlled. This effectively creates 2 types of steel in the one blade. One type is flexible, the other very hard, which means your katana can be sharp and shatterproof.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
The boundary between the 2 steels is called the hamon and is unique to every sword. With the average katana fight lasting just a few seconds, the samurai were very keen on getting their tactics sorted out. The obvious thing would be to strike first, but samurai had more cunning methods too.
You would allow your opponent to attack first, and your counterattack would be the final attack.
Katana combat is all about deceiving your opponent.
It's about the picture that you present to your opponent, from use of your eyes, from how your body is moved or not.
Problems deceiving my opponent.
The samurai trained from the age of 5 to become expert at the subtle skills required of the warrior. James broke down one of their classic training routines.
In this particular one, I'll draw the attack by giving him an opening. He'll begin to take advantage of that by raising his sword up. As he attacks my head, I hesitate just a second to give him the feeling that he can cut me. The deception in this is that he feels he's going to be successful in this cut.
There were other weapons in feudal Japan, but it's the samurai's katana that wrote the rule book. This sword was both the medium and the message.
The knowledge that you gain from its study is what really makes it so special.
The katana coexisted with firearms for 500 years in Japan, but eventually steel was superseded by lead.
Katana is a fantastic weapon, but it's limited geographically. It's all tied up with the samurai and his mindset.
The guy who knows how to swing a sword, if you let him get within 3 feet of you, you want to be afraid of him. The reason I prefer handguns is I can address that issue at 40 feet, and he can't do a thing to me.
Despite its reputation as the perfect sword, the katana cuts no deeper than number 10 because it's a weapon caught up in a feudal time warp. No amount of ritualized skill will protect you from a bullet. Still to come on the greatest ever weapons, another 9 ways to skin a cat and the promise of a real pasting.
Hey!
Carrying the Japanese katana sent an unequivocal message to the world that the samurai were ready to rumble. Our next greatest ever weapon defines the style of another era. Welcome to the secretive world of the Walther PPK.
The PPK is very much of a cult weapon.
James Bond is a modern cowboy, and he needs a trusty friend. The PPK fits the bill. It can fit into James Bond's pocket, but it can fit into his girlfriend's handbag just as easily.
The Walther PPK emerged in 1931, designed as a concealed weapon for the German police. It was rapidly adopted by various secret services. Ian Fleming, the creator of 007, was in British naval intelligence and knew of the PPK's reputation.
When the Walther PPK was invented, it was just considered top of the line. Obviously, that's why Q gave James Bond the Walther PPK.
It is the culmination of years of development, packed into one small, concealable, lightweight semi-automatic pistol.
Still credible after all these years, the PPK has a starring role at this concealed weapons training center in California, where these women are about to go undercover.
I have never done this before, so it'll be a great learning experience.
I'm a stunt woman. I'm a classy stunt woman. I don't have a lot of muscles, so I need a smaller gun.
I actually own a PPK. When I bought the gun, I figured if it was good enough for James, it would be good enough for me.
But will the PPK experience leave them shaken or stirred?
You line it up, put it in, give it one shove. Don't be going like that. Now, as far as the safety, when you can see red, you know the safety is off.
The PPK's claim to fame include a foolproof safety system. Nice to know if you're going to be tucking one into your pants.
The safety mechanism blocks the trigger, and it doesn't work at all. That's all you can do with it, which makes it much more user-friendly and much safer. It's been copied widely. It's very simple, but very effective.
It's vital to have a simple safety catch, but a lot of accidents happen when people pull the trigger without realizing there's a bullet in the chamber. So to prevent such an accidental discharge, the PPK has an extra visual safety device.
This particular design has a loaded chamber indicator, which is a small pin that sticks out the back of the slide that shows whether there's a round in the chamber or not. This totally takes away the ability of having an accidental discharge.
Unlike most other pistols, you can look at it and glance and know whether you've got a dangerous weapon in your hand or not. And if you're a clever spy, you can know whether your opponent has got a weapon that's armed and loaded or not as well.
Another revolutionary feature is that the PPK was the first successful double-action semi-automatic. It means you can fire the first shot without needing to cock the gun, making you quicker on the draw.
Fire.
And each magazine carries 7 bullets.
It works on the simplest possible system for a semi-automatic, which is blowback. When you fire it, the power generated by the combustion of the cartridge blows the slide back, that collects another round, and it runs forward, chambers a new round, and you fire your second shot. And you can keep on doing that as long as there's ammunition in the magazine.
Okay, back to the holster. Let's talk a little bit about concealability and about how you're going to actually carry your gun in a concealed position. Personally, I like the fanny pack. The reason that I like that, it has a built-in holster right inside. But everybody's different. Everybody may have their own preference. I'm trying to get a hold of Louis Vuitton to make us a nice purse with a holster in it as we speak.
Using the PPK was very exciting. This is how I did the first time I shot. So I think that would stop someone, or at least scare them.
Ah, that's where the PPK comes unstuck. Its concealability means that it must use smaller bullets.
Okay, this is the bullet for the PPK. It's a 380. It's rather small. Does not have a lot of stopping power. Okay, just as opposed to, say, the 45 long Colt, which is quite large. You can see the difference in the two calibers. This obviously would not be a concealable gun.
So if you shoot somebody with this, they're just going to be angry?
Or? That's a good possibility. Of course, it's always the placement of the bullet is very important.
It is a lightweight bullet. At the more extreme end of its range, it might actually have difficulty penetrating heavy clothing.
Well, it beats being hit with a knitting needle, but the smaller the hole it makes, the less likely it is to kill you. A 9mm is a mouse gun.
This would be a great backup gun. Almost every cop carries a backup gun, and this would be small, concealable, and a nice gun to carry as a backup gun.
The PPK has surprise on its side, but lacks the knockout punch that a truly great weapon needs. The Bond gun makes 009. Greatest weapon number 8 has faded in and out of history several times over the last 2,500 years. Stand easy, it's the Pike.
Tactically, the Pike is from way back. I mean, go back to Alexander the Great, for heaven's sake.
Pike really follows the axiom that simple is better.
You get about 20 feet of range, and the guy 20 feet away is less likely to hurt you than the guy 6 feet away. It's that simple.
The Pike's claim to greatest ever status is because of its enormous tactical impact when used in massed ranks, combined with a simple training regime. Teamwork is the force behind the Pike. After Alexander's antics, the Pike fell out of favor, but returned to form 1,000 years later.
Throughout the late 14th, 15th, 16th, and even into the 17th century, the pike force was the mainstay of many armies.
Brian McIlmoyle is a medieval martial arts instructor and former Canadian Army drill sergeant. The greatest ever challenged him to convert this Toronto rugby team into a crack pike squad in less than 2 hours.
Right turn! By the center! Quick! March!
In days gone by, where you have large peasant armies, you can train those individuals to be quite a ferocious pike squad in very few minutes indeed. And I don't know any other weapon system that falls into that category.
It's a simple weapon, a long wooden shaft with a long iron spear tip right at the end of it. So it's an unwieldy weapon. You need to be physically strong.
The pike square was the basic tactical formation for pikemen. Renaissance armies typically had up to 400 men arranged in this way.
The square formation is very important because it allows you to change direction without changing formation. So you can be marching forward, and then quickly you can march to the left and march to the right, but still present exactly the same threat. The thing about the pike, it's mostly a terror weapon. It's designed to intimidate and force people to run before it actually comes to engagement.
It was the introduction of stirruped cavalry in the 15th century that really brought the pike back to prominence. Pikes grew longer, and tactics evolved to deal with the new threat.
Effectively, what you're going to do is kebab any unfortunate horseman who comes too close.
Charge for horse!
You get 100 guys with pikes and 50 guys on horses. The horses will stop short of the pikes because horses are smart enough to realize that you can get hurt that way.
Charge! Pike!
The tactical effectiveness of the pike meant that from the 16th century, there was even a living to be made as a mercenary pike squad. And incredibly, they still exist today. The Swiss Guard is a pike force that has been looking after the Pope for over 500 years. The fact is, the pike refuses to lay down and die. It's not just propping up the Pope. Its legacy is to be seen on army drill squares across the world.
All of the commands, all of the actions that you see with modern rifle drill have their foundation in pike drill.
I thought it was a big stick at first that you would flail around like a dummy, but you end up having to have a lot of control and a lot of discipline. I think we might use the pike in practice, but we may end up with a few less players after each session.
Give me another 20 rugby players, and we'll replace the Swiss at the Vatican.
The pike is only useful when it comes in a pack. For the individual combatant, better to drop the pike and run. Alexander's empire builder makes it to only number 8. Next up, the weapon that heralded the modern era of warfare by rethinking the idea of a handgun and bringing the joys of black powder to the masses. At number 7, the Arcubus.
When I think Arcubus, personally, I think changing the state of warfare. You had projectiles that could not be seen that were wounding and killing.
You wouldn't want to get hit by the bullet from one. At 50 yards, it will actually penetrate about 3 millimeters of steel plate.
The Arcubus is hugely important because it confirms that men wearing armour have a limited utility on the battlefield.
Blasting its way to prominence in the Battle of Pavia in 1525, the Arcubus became the benchmark for an entire species of guns, whose basic design persisted until the 19th century.
It is an important weapon system because it says goodbye to the knights of old and heralds in the new era that we probably associate better with the Industrial Revolution.
The greatest ever arranged to meet with medieval gunsmith Gary Bate and 2 of his clients to experience the Arcubus in full effect.
The things that come out of the barrel, soft lead balls. These that come out of the end of the barrel, the muzzle velocity of about 1,000 feet per second. On impact would do incredible damage. They would just split into bits. You could be hitting the arm and still get a piece of lead in the heart or the lung.
Early guns were crude, fired from the waist and ignited like a firework.
I think we missed.
By comparison, the Arcubus was a revolution. It provided a wooden stock, shaped to allow it to nestle in the shoulder, which now meant that you could aim the gun. There was also a simple trigger mechanism, the earliest of which was called a matchlock.
It's called a matchlock because it has a piece of burning match held in some jaws.
The match had to be slow burning to last for the duration of the average battle, about 3 hours.
The match was a particularly unsavoury piece of kit. To make this burn slowly, it was soaked in human urine. The best urine came from bishops. They drank a large quantity of red wine, which helps with the chemical reaction, and also it would be blessed urine as well.
It's the chemical compound saltpeter, found in urine, that gives the match its fizz. And saltpeter is one of the ingredients of black powder, the oomph behind the Arcubus. But early gunpowder was not just powerful, it was notoriously unreliable and messy.
There's actually a horrible substance. It creates 300 times its own volume in a grey-white smoke, so it blots out whatever you're shooting. And it leaves a terrible residue in the bore, which is called fouling. After 4 or 5 shots, the barrel is so choked up that you cannot physically ram a ball down into the breech. So what you have to do is produce a musket ball that is undersized. It's much smaller than the bore size.
And the undersized ball bounces about as it travels down the barrel.
And when it leaves the barrel, it could go there, or there, or there. It was always said at the time that no man was ever killed by the musket ball that was fired at him at 200 yards.
So the Arcubus was definitely not a precision weapon.
They were designed for mass volley fire, and it was like firing a huge blast of shotgun balls down at the enemy. The first side that broke was the side that lost. It was crude, but it was effective.
The greatest ever challenged Gary to demonstrate the penetrating power of his modern Arcubus.
A 2-inch solid piece of English oak. Stand it up on here. I will stake the reputation of my guns and the reputation of my workmanship on the fact that with one shot I can put a hole clean through that board. I'm going to use a small wax candle. I've never done this before with a candle, but I'm certain this is going to work. Well, I hope it is. Right, let's have a look what we've got. It's certainly obliterated the thing. Look at that. We've even got the candle wick is impaled in solid oak. What more can I say? The devastating power of the Arcubus, living proof.
The strength of the Arcubus comes in volley shot, and for that you need a lot of people and you need a lot of arquebuses. So as an individual weapon system, it leaves a lot to be desired.
The Arcubus was the father, mother, aunt and uncle of modern firearms, so it deserves its ranking at number 7. For the next greatest ever weapon, we need to wind the clock back 40,000 years. Number 6 greatest ever weapon is the war boomerang, the boomerang that never went away. We know the boomerang as an amazing, if baffling, toy, but the granddaddy of the returning boomerang has an altogether more bloodthirsty use.
It's easy to dismiss the boomerang as a quaint Australian weapon system that has no relevance. But it's hugely important because it goes back to the dawn of history and because it has an equivalent in most civilizations around the world.
The non-returning throwing stick was a common hunting weapon in the ancient world. These were carved sticks that had some aerodynamic properties that made them fly consistently. What's unusual about the Australian throwing stick is that it's stuck around. Today, the skills of making and using the war boomerang have all but disappeared. But the greatest ever travelled to Scotland, of all places, to challenge boomerang maker Richard Ogilvie to reproduce one of his collection of authentic, antique war boomerangs.
This is one, it's a very, very old boomerang. The one we've been using today is a model for replicating a weapon. I would suspect it's a couple of hundred years because it's been finely worked with stone. You can see the rough carvings on the surface.
Richard was going to follow the authentic methods of the Aborigines wherever possible, and the first challenge was to find the right piece of wood.
You can see quite a few potential boomerangs and all these gnarled bends. Typically, the Aboriginals would find a blown tree and take a piece of wood out from that point, and you can see how the grain would run through the trunk through there.
While Richard continued with his precision engineering, we took the original war boomerang to Cambridge University Aeronautics Lab to see exactly what makes it tick. They made a scale model cross-section for their wind tunnel.
We've taken a bit out from here, somewhere in the middle, and try to replicate that in large.
So what we can see is on the straight side the air goes more or less unperturbed, and on the curved side it's trying to follow the curvature, and that generates locally some low pressures and gives us a force in that direction, a lift force, just like on an aerofoil.
This is a bit like with a helicopter then, generating lift that will lift the helicopter off the ground.
Exactly, yeah, it's exactly the same mechanism.
And maybe the stone tooling marks on the surface of the boomerang weren't just accidental.
There might be an aerodynamic reason for this, because when you think of other examples like a golf ball, they've got these dimples on, and they're on there deliberately because they will actually help to reduce the drag and increase the lift of a golf ball. It's possible that a similar effect was discovered here, that this slightly rough boomerang actually went better than the smooth one. Well, I think it's impressive that they've discovered the principle of aerofoils in those days by pure trial and error.
Richard's war boomerang had the aerodynamic thumbs up, but how deadly would it prove to be? The greatest ever was prepared to sacrifice a large melon in the name of science. Now that would hurt.
It's revolutionary for its day, but it's so old, we've almost forgotten how important it was.
It's awfully low-tech, cutting-edge technology for 100,000 years ago.
The Aborigines are a pretty peaceful bunch, and that's just as well, because if you're expecting trouble more serious than a wallaby, you better be packing some real firepower. The war boomerang won't be getting any further than number 6. The number 5 greatest ever weapon acquired a formidable reputation on both sides of the moral fence. As a result, it very nearly missed its moment in history. The Thompson submachine gun.
The Thompson is the first submachine gun. It's something you can fire from the hip and spray bullets around.
The Thompson, it's a honey. It shoots wonderfully well. I don't know anybody who's ever held one didn't love it.
Feeling lucky, punk? There is just something about the design of it that just makes it right. It became so iconic, in fact, that any form of submachine gun tends to be called a Tommy gun, and that's fame.
A submachine gun shoots smaller bullets than a regular machine gun. This means it can be more compact and lighter and can be carried by an individual soldier rather than the two-man operation of its big brothers. The Tommy gun enjoyed its finest hour in the hands of Allied forces during the Second World War. The greatest ever hooked up this World War II veteran with the weapon that kept him out of trouble more than 60 years ago.
Seems to be heavier than I remember it, but then I'm not getting any younger. My name is Peter Ford, and I was in number 47 Royal Marine Commando when we landed on Gold Beach on D-Day. I think the Tommy gun in its day was very, very good. You had a certain amount of confidence with a weapon like this because of its destructive capability. If you sprayed a few of these rounds around, it didn't do the enemy much good.
The novel fact with the Thompson is that it fires a very powerful cartridge.
Previous attempts at making a submachine gun had used small caliber bullets, too puny for the job in hand. The use of a whopping 45 caliber pistol round is the key to the Tommy gun's success. Keeping your finger on the trigger in automatic mode would fire 700 rounds a minute.
That slug is a real man-stopper.
But size isn't everything. It's what you do with it that counts. Peter offered to demonstrate the tactical use of the Tommy to movie armourer Nick Jeffries. Their objective, an assault on a dangerous row of Skittles.
As you're advancing, I fire at the Skittles, and now cover me to the next bit of cover we've got.
It's exactly this type of close-quarter assault that the Tommy gun was originally designed for.
It's developed by John F. Thompson at the end of the First World War, responding to the need for a trench broom, something you can clear out trenches full of soldiers. Close fighting, where automatic fire is preferable.
Unfortunately for General Thompson, the First World War ended just as the gun began production. The military had no use for it, so civilian customers had to be found.
In the 1920s, there were no wars going on that involved the United States, but they did have prohibition, which was very fortunate for Thompson because it meant that the gangsters took to his gun like a duck to water.
It's used by Al Capone and all his henchmen, and just as importantly, appears in all the films detailing their activities.
There were a lot of films made about that time where the Tommy gun featured as a weapon of the local gangster. Obviously, the powers that be had a look at it and thought, well, this would be a good little weapon for us.
So, in World War II, the Tommy gun had an opportunity to reform its bad boy image. At last, its time had come. And it was the British commandos who particularly loved it.
We did have the choice of weapons, but some of us liked this one because you just let it rip, you know.
Safety considerations meant that Peter had been firing blanks up until now, but he was itching to see the legendary power of the real 45 caliber bullet once more.
I think those bowling pins at that distance would be the equivalent to shooting a man at 100 yards. Here goes.
The virtues of the Tommy were also its downfall.
It's beautifully made. The reason they stopped making them was they cost too much.
And it also rattles. And that can be dangerous if you're in the sort of fighting where you don't want the enemy to know where you are.
The Thompson is a curious weapon. If it wasn't for the Second World War, it would have been just another gun that would have disappeared into the mists of time.
Yeah, quite interesting. It was great, really, yeah.
The Tommy gun was always a luxury weapon, but war is all about the bottom line, and so the Thompson submachine gun makes it to only number 5. The fourth greatest ever weapon has taken modern warfare's most secret strategy to a new level. Sniping finally got sexy with Barrett 82. In Iraq, this weapon has proved invaluable, both in open terrain and urban fighting, and its awesome power has guaranteed the Barrett a place in the arsenals of the world's elite forces.
A sniper using the Barrett rifle is to a certain extent king of the battlefield.
The Barrett 50 is a wonderfully accurate weapon, and when you squeeze the trigger on it, you know something important just happened.
The Barrett shoots a 50 caliber round. It's a very large bullet. That's not a bullet, mate. There's a bullet. It's effective at a very long range. There's kills getting out to 2 kilometers.
In my opinion, I think the Barrett is an awesome weapon. I wouldn't want to be on the other end of it.
But it isn't just people that the sniper targets. The heavyweight Barrett 82 has built its reputation as an anti-material rifle.
It's an outstanding weapon for engaging equipment and vehicles. You know, like a Jeep-sized target or larger.
Using a $2 cartridge on a static aircraft will render a $50 million fighter aircraft scrap metal.
In military terminology, snipers are a great force multiplier. They can achieve, with a few bullets, what hundreds of infantrymen could achieve in the same battle.
Sending such a large bullet down the barrel means that the Barrett should have a massive recoil, but the design employs a muzzle brake to reduce the effect. Angled fins deflect some of the exhaust gases backwards to cushion the blow. But watch out, all that energy is still going somewhere.
If anyone's standing left or right of the gun, they're going to absorb a lot of that recoil and impact from the round going off.
First time I found myself in the muzzle blast of the Barrett, felt like someone just ran and kicked me up in the face.
The origin of the modern sniper goes back to World War I, when the Germans started picking off British field commanders at long range.
The British response is to bring in big game hunters from the Empire, from Africa and from India, who will teach soldiers how to stalk a prey and kill with a first-round hit.
Stalking and fieldcraft are still at the core of the sniper's art. Snipers operate in two-man teams, one shooting, whilst the other observes.
The observer's responsibility is to observe the impacts and give the shooter the adjustments needed to get back onto target if he's missing the target.
When firing at long ranges, there's a lot of things you have to consider. Mostly the wind's going to be your biggest factor.
But as the distances get longer, things get more complicated, and technology has come to the rescue.
With our handheld computer, we're able to take the temperature, barometric pressure, relative humidity, even the spin of your bullet, and this thing will calculate it all, help you out with a more accurate shot, getting you that first round hit that you want.
But accuracy begins at home, with the gun itself, and crucial to the design of the Barrett is its floating barrel.
The floating barrel, it means quite literally that the barrel floats free. It doesn't touch any other part of the rifle once it emerges from the breech. As long as you let the barrel vibrate, then the next shot will cause exactly the same vibration and will go where you point it. If anything stops that barrel vibrating, if something is pressing on it, then no two shots are going to be the same.
The Barrett is all about purity of design, getting down to essentials, and the same goes for the skills of the men who use them.
You want to get your thumb off of the grip, and then you want to take your tip of your finger and put that on the trigger and just slowly squeeze back until the sear releases. The Barrett, I'd trust my life to it. It's a good weapon to have. Keeps heads down and takes some heads out, too.
The Barrett Light 50 in the hands of an expert marksman is a potent cocktail, but it's not a weapon for the faint-hearted. To get further up the greatest ever list, the common man needs to stand some chance of victory. Number 3 on our list is the weapon of the people that changed the course of English history. For once, fantasy is more than matched by reality. It's the longbow. From a time when bows and arrows meant business.
A longbow is really a very, very simple thing. It is a bent stick.
An elegant weapon, very difficult to master. What people don't understand is you have to have arms like Schwarzenegger if you want to draw a longbow.
They're firing off 6 or 7 arrows in a minute. So it's the machine gun of its day.
This arrow weighs 3 ounces, and when I loose it, it'll be doing 193 feet a second. That was bloody close, wasn't it?
Simon Stanley is one of the few men in the world able to shoot a maximum strength medieval longbow with accuracy. Just drawing the string on this bow is the equivalent of lifting his own body weight.
That's not bad, bearing in mind that that arrowhead's blunt.
Simon's skill is as a result of starting to shoot the bow at the age of 6 and a body conditioned by a lifetime on the farm. Simon really is medieval. We got him together with Robert Hardy, Shakespearean actor and renowned longbow expert, to reveal the secrets of the longbow.
In essence, it's simply a piece of timber chosen for its strength, its density, its bendability. And so the very best possible wood to make it from is yew wood. It is the perfect God-given spring.
The white creamy wood is the first layer of wood that you come to under the bark of the tree, and that carries the nutrients up the tree. Now, the red wood is dead wood, if you like, the skeleton of the tree. The sapwood resists tension, and the dead heartwood resists compression, and so you get a natural spring. We're going to shoot at that road sign down yonder. It's about 200 yards away. Originally, they used to practice at nothing less than 240 yards for warfare.
The obvious defense against the wooden spring was metal armor, and so the medieval period had its very own arms race. More powerful bows meant thicker armor, meant more powerful bows.
Until the bows reached the absolute limit of human strength to pull. At the height of its military use, the longbow arrow could kill a horse at 300 yards, and the right kind of arrowhead would go through a cuirass, a breastplate.
The greatest ever challenged Simon, also a blacksmith, to make an authentic medieval armor-piercing arrowhead.
Shot out of the right bow, it should be capable of shooting through reasonable quality armor of the time and dispatching its target.
Brave words, but how would the nifty nose cone perform under test conditions?
This is ballistic putty. In effect, it's the same density as a body, so when it's shot at, it reacts in a similar way.
Now, this is metal that we're going to put in front of it to represent armor plating.
What we've got now is a body behind a steel covering, and I'm going to fire an armor-piercing arrowhead into it and see what we can do.
Let's get out of the way. Any distance is a realistic distance to shoot from, between 300 yards and point blank, right up to the face. That's gone through.
If they'd have been hit in the chest from this strike, they'd have been dead instantaneously or very shortly after being hit. Also, you get the shock effect of what it'd do inside the body cavity. Look, just there. Yeah. There's the impact from where the arrows move the metal, split the metal. And you can see some traces of the metal, so that'd be all inside the body cavity as well.
Yeah, sure.
You really wouldn't know what had hit you, the way it penetrated the armour of French knights who thought hitherto that they were invulnerable.
The longbow terrified the French, terrified Europe, and very nearly gave the English kings the kingdom of France.
The longbow dominated English warfare for 4 centuries, eventually being swept aside by the easy charms of gunpowder.
But as Winston Churchill pointed out, the longbow, for speed of shooting, accuracy, was not really outshot until the rifled barrel of the American Civil War, which is an incredible thing to think.
As soon as guns unlocked the energy inside black powder, the archer was an endangered species. Time out for the longbow. It's at number 3. Our penultimate greatest ever weapon is the dominant firearm in the world today. Created by the Soviet Union in 1947, it swept across the world. The Kalashnikov AK-47.
It's such an icon. It's probably the most recognizable firearm in use around the world.
That's the only decent consumer product the Soviet Union ever turned out, except maybe for vodka.
The AK is not fussy. You could give it to somebody who'd never fired a gun before, give them 10 minutes instruction on it, that's it, sorted.
And with perhaps 100 million AK-47s on the planet, this is a gun with a mandate.
The moment you equip one country, one tribe, one group with an AK-47, you give them an ability to influence events that would hitherto have been absolutely impossible. It has changed the face of warfare, and it's changed the nature of international relations and politics.
But the AK isn't running for president just yet.
I think they're beautiful to look at as well. It's it's a sexy weapon.
And the pride of the Soviet arsenal has found a home from home in the most unlikely of places, Las Vegas, where its latest incarnation is manufactured.
I'm Alessio Canestrelli, and here we are in beautiful Las Vegas, the home of entertainment, and now also the home of one of the finest semi-automatic AK-47 in the world. Today my friend Joe's in town, and whenever my friends are in town, we hook up and talk AK. Good to see you.
The world-beating AK-47 design has been embraced by the sporting rifle fraternity in the United States. Confirmation that the AK-47 has finally come in from the cold.
We've created a whole culture of AK collectors and enthusiasts and historians because of its great history, and also its wonderful inventor, Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov.
Kalashnikov is now a hero of the revolution, but when he invented the AK-47, he was a humble tank commander, emerging from the devastation of World War II.
Kalashnikov's genius really was that AK-47 is cheap, it's simple, and it works. It sort of bridges the gap between the rifle and the submachine gun.
Kalashnikov's design recognizes the fact that most real combat takes place at ranges of around 300 meters or less. The AK delivers deadly force only up to this distance, but it can bombard the target with up to 600 rounds a minute, like a submachine gun. This high rate of fire is achieved by diverting some of the high-pressure gases created when a bullet is fired to eject the spent cartridge and pop another one in the breech, a sort of ballistic recycling. But it's the mass producibility of the AK-47 that's been the key to its success.
The AK-47 follows the Russian philosophy of let's make a lot of them. Let's make a lot of them inexpensive, and if we lose some of them in the process, we'll have a lot more to fill the gap.
The body of the gun, called the receiver, contains the key mechanical parts and was particularly challenging to manufacture.
Traditionally, the AK back in the 50s was made from a giant block of steel such as this, whittled down after 120 machining steps to this. Once the technology caught up with Mother Russia, out came this stamped receiver, which is basically a flat bent up into a channel. They were able to produce these in large numbers very easily with stampings.
5 decades of continuous production meant that over 50 armies now use the AK-47, and crucially, the basic design remains consistent.
This is actually a fairly early Soviet one. This is a Hungarian one, but the magazines, in fact, are completely interchangeable, even though they're made years apart and in different countries. So if you pick up an AK and it doesn't have a magazine, you can pick up any other AK magazine, slot it in, and you know that gun will work.
The interchangeability of AK-47 parts makes it a favorite of NATO special forces in places like Iraq. But there's another advantage too.
They have a very distinctive sound when they're fired. And if one of these is being fired in the street, the local people, they will not necessarily realize that it's being fired, perhaps by British or American special forces.
Meanwhile, in the Nevada desert, Las Vegas's very own Kalashnikov is getting put through its paces. Featuring all the AK-47 characteristics, apart from fully automatic operation, the SAM-7 is a highly refined homage to the classic AK-47. The Kalashnikov's reputation is based on reliability in extremis. The greatest ever challenged Arsenal Inc., the manufacturers of the SAM-7, to push Kalashnikov's design to the limit.
Well, normally I wouldn't recommend immersing a firearm in water, but this is an extreme test of its reliability. Okay, it's good and soaked. We're gonna let a little bit of the water out of the barrel. Now it's ready to fire. It worked flawlessly.
Water torture is bad enough, but the enemy of any gun is dust.
I don't recommend doing this to any firearm.
And the brutal treatment was not over. The greatest ever test of Kalashnikov's masterwork was yet to come.
We're going to see how this SAM-7 stands up to being run over by a Humvee. Well, I'm impressed. That's pretty amazing. It's a testament to the ruggedness of this design, and I wouldn't recommend doing this yourself at home.
The Kalashnikov wears its heart on its sleeve and delivers what it promises. But for today's military, its accuracy lets it down. The AK-47 scoops the #2 position. From 10 down to 2, we've seen deadly springs, wax like lead, and firepower that could ruin your entire day. Our #1 greatest ever weapon packs the definitive punch. 9 came close, but to be the greatest, we all need to appreciate its power. The #1 greatest ever weapon creates its own opportunities to win, and you'll never leave home without it. The greatest ever weapon is the individual themselves.
It's easy to forget that your mind and your body are weapons in themselves. Because most soldiers on the battlefield, when they run out of ammunition, when they've thrown a weapon or stuck it in someone, are then left with feet and hands and mind. So soldiers are always trained in unarmed combat.
All societies have come up with unarmed fighting systems for those moments when you're caught without your hardware.
Martial arts evolved empty-hand when there were no weapons, when you didn't have a choice.
It's probably martial arts movies that most of us think of as the ultimate in unarmed combat.
The concept on television that you're going to fight 4 or 5 guys in a dark alley with your martial arts skill is one of the nice fantasies.
But there is a reality behind the vaudeville. At the top of the list of the most effective martial arts is Wing Chun. This was movie legend Bruce Lee's original fighting style, and it packs a real punch.
Instead of using the hand, I will use my shoulder.
Sifu Simon Lau is one of the world's great masters of Wing Chun.
Defense and attack at the same time on the neck, and counter-attack to finish them off. In the Wing Chun system, the movements, they don't do the high kick. They don't have to shout. They don't have to duck down. They don't have to be rolling on the floor. It seems to be very gentle. But when you're good at it, it can be fatal. I will slide down and attack also at the same time. In the Wing Chun system, you are using the whole body for fighting.
The simplicity of Wing Chun is down to its inventor, Wu Mai, a Buddhist nun who lived 300 years ago. Fed up of being mugged on the way to the shrine, she devised a system perfect for women, designed to combat more physically powerful opponents. The greatest ever invited some modern-day nuns to follow in her footprints and become Wing Chun nuns.
I'm a missionary in Vietnam. I travel a lot in remote villages, and physically we are vulnerable.
I've never ever felt under threat as a prison chaplain, but one never knows.
You have a very good weapon within you, but all you need now is just to discover it. Right hand forward.
But can Simon really turn these novices into warrior nuns?
Right hand.
This is the classic Wing Chun training exercise, sticky hands.
If your balance is poor, your arm have no power. You're learning how to get the balance of your body, and then you realize that your arm is not give you any power.
Sticky hands also addresses a fundamental fact of fighting, the reality of confrontation at close range. It's not something that people are used to.
In the Wing Chun system, the sticking hand, it is important because they are get used to the distance of the people who waving their arms in front of them. Yes.
It's conquering our basic fears of violence that all martial training strives to achieve.
Ancient warriors knew that the calmer you were under duress, the better you could respond. It's not that you suppress your fear, it's that you allow it and accept it, allow it to elevate your function, and it becomes a companion.
Next up, Wing Chun's simultaneous punching and blocking.
Blocking, yes, it will be like this.
To fight effectively, you need to train, and you have to have a certain mental attitude, and that doesn't come easily to everybody. You can teach a lot of people how to wield a pike or fire a gun, but you can't persuade everyone to engage mentally in combat if they don't want to.
Simon hoped the nuns would be inspired by the short-range power of Wing Chun. Board breaking is the classic test of a martial artist's power and concentration. And then it was their turn.
You all can do it.
If the nuns can crack this, there'll be a credit to their habits.
Now, I want you to break this board by the palm strike. To hit it with your mind. Our body is the most dangerous weapon. Now you're going to learn how to using it. Now you hit hard, must not be afraid. Hit hard. Hey!
combat is enormously shocking. You quite often can't do something in combat that you haven't previously rehearsed. Otherwise, your opponent will simply overwhelm you before you know what's happened, and you're dead.
Hit. Hey!
It's a kind of a new discovery. It's not just a non-violent defense, but it's stop violence before it ever happened.
Mentally must not be afraid.
The best weapon of all time is the human mind. The others are tools. By themselves, they're nothing without us.
Martial training is all about learning to harness the mind and the body to act together in the extreme circumstances of unavoidable confrontation. These women have shown that the greatest ever weapon is right at your fingertips. So there you have it, the 10 greatest ever weapons, each with its own unique character, but sharing the same grim intention. It's hard to imagine a world without them. Coming up on the greatest ever, the world's ultimate bombers. We'll get up close and personal with the latest high-tech Terminator and go flying in a World War II classic. Also on our list, dive bombers, torpedo bombers and jet attack bombers. And you'll hear what it's like to drop the biggest bomb of all.
There's this huge, massive explosion. It turns the Pacific from night to day.
Military expert and writer Tom Clancy will tell it like it is.
Well, the old saying is that fighter pilots make movies and bomber pilots make history.
We'll also meet the pilots and crew who've taken these planes to hell and back.
But the flak was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. So the fact that I'm here is just a luck of the draw.
Flying at that speed, at that height, seeing everything go past, and really I think that's what everyone joins to do.
The world's greatest ever bombers are all fueled up, loaded for bear, and coming right at you. We start with the number 10 bomber. Ugly, completely obsolete, but surprisingly effective. The British Royal Navy's Fairy Swordfish torpedo bomber.
The Fairy Swordfish is an anomaly. It had no right to be in World War II at all. Everything about it screams 1918.
It's not the prettiest airplane in the world, but it's very nice to fly.
You have to look at that airplane with love because it was a hell of an airplane to fly in a time when it shouldn't have been flying at all.
Admirals called it the Swordfish, but the crews called it the string bag because of its multiple bracing wires that held the wings together. First flown in 1935, the Swordfish was an effective ship killer because it could drop high explosive torpedoes and then run for cover. Crewed by a pilot, observer and a gunner, the Swordfish first made history in 1940 when it hit the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor.
Under cover of darkness, it went right into the harbor at Taranto and caused enormous damage to the enemy fleet. It was a textbook example of what the Swordfish was there to do.
Goggles and flying helmet firmly fastened, the greatest ever got some airtime in a very rare and airworthy Swordfish.
Oh, the Swordfish is a great airplane to fly and almost take your hands off and feet off the rudders in a turn.
Slower than its fighter counterparts and carrying a single torpedo, the Swordfish had a rather pedestrian top speed of 225 kilometers an hour. But the Swordfish was designed to be stable, making it perfect for dropping torpedoes.
The Swordfish was a good torpedo bomber precisely because it was slow and steady, rock steady. You could put it precisely where you wanted to be and launch a torpedo and know that it was going to launch properly.
The Swordfish's slow landing and takeoff speeds made it ideal for operating from small escort carriers. But with a wingspan of 14 meters, it could have been a tight fit aboard ship. The solution? Tuck those wings back after flight and fold them forward for flying.
Okay.
Always stay in the same position when you fold the wings. I don't know how they do that, but it's an amazing piece of work anyway.
High-strength steel locking pins keep the wings where they're supposed to be during flight. And like all carrier-based aircraft, the Swordfish was designed to stop on a sixpence. With its tail hooked down, the pilot would aim for cables stretched across the carrier's deck.
The Swordfish, arguably its finest moment, was in the hunt for and destruction of the Bismarck.
In 1941, flying from the carrier Ark Royal, a Swordfish put a crippling torpedo into the Bismarck's steering gear. But why couldn't the battleship's anti-aircraft gunners knock the very slow-flying Swordfish from the skies?
The reason it survived its runs is the German fire control equipment on Bismarck didn't anticipate that anything would fly that slowly and be committed to combat, and so they kept missing by firing ahead of where the Swordfish were. That's why one of them survived to drop the torpedo that hit Bismarck's rudder.
Left steaming in circles, the Royal Navy moved in for the kill and finished off the Bismarck. But by the middle of World War II, the venerable but vulnerable Swordfish was dropped as a torpedo bomber because it was getting slaughtered by enemy fighters.
No matter how dangerous it was, they went in and got shot down. It was a charge of a light brigade.
Dropping torpedoes was its forte. The flip side of it was that once you dropped your torpedo, you were very likely to be shot down.
It was too damn slow. You know, there's an old saying in the Air Force, speed is life. Well, that didn't have any speed at all.
The crew had no armor, so that if you killed the pilot was gone.
It was substandard technology for 60 years ago. But you know, the fact that people took it into combat is a very interesting commentary on the quality and the courage of the British flight crews that took it off carriers.
She had her moments of glory, but the Swordfish quickly became a flying anachronism. That's why this remarkable biplane checks out in the number 10 slot of the greatest ever bombers. We've got 9 more awesome aircraft coming your way, including the nuclear bomber that starred in the James Bond film Thunderball. The Swordfish claims the number 10 slot in our search for the greatest ever bombers. In the number 9 position, a terrifying symbol of Nazi power, the bent-wing Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber.
The Stuka displayed Teutonic efficiency, both in delivering bombs and in scaring the crap out of the people it was attacking.
There's no other aircraft looks like that. Thank goodness.
I think the Stuka looks like a mean aircraft. It's like an angry eagle diving down.
It's an insult to aerodynamics, but it's a beautiful plane, actually. It's a lovely plane to fly, and I enjoy having it very much.
The Stuka, crewed by a pilot and tail gunner, was the first aircraft designed specifically for dive bombing. When the German Blitzkrieg rolled over Poland, Holland, and France, the Stuka was there, clearing the way for ground troops by taking out specific targets, such as bridges, tanks, troops, and bunkers.
The Stuka tactic for air-to-ground coordination was brand new and highly successful during World War II. The combined arms aspect, the pilots were key in perfecting those techniques.
The Stuka dive bomber was a very precise form of aerial artillery. By diving on the target at a low level, pilots could accurately release the bombs a very short distance from the target.
I can't think of any aircraft that was more perfectly suited for its place in history than the Stuka. From an operational standpoint, it was a very effective and precise dive bomber. You're essentially aiming at the target and releasing the bomb at the optimum point.
Mitch Salmons owns and flies this replica Stuka dive bomber.
Stuka could come down almost in a vertical aspect to hit its target, when other bombers, of course, couldn't be as accurate.
With a bomb that doesn't have any kind of guidance system, dive bombing is the best way to do it. And the steepest you can dive it and aim it at the target, the more chance you have of success.
The Stuka's speed-limiting dive brakes were key in slowing this bomber down and making it accurate and stable in the dive.
It was one of those aircraft that you could put into a very steep dive and it would not accelerate.
The Stuka was also the first bomber to actively use a terrifying form of psychological warfare.
But to add insult to injury, with typically German humour, if you will, they added a siren that made the thing scream like a banshee as it came down.
French soldiers would just put their heads down and cower because of this noise, and they knew they were going to get bombs very soon.
Everybody leaped to claim the credit for it. Hitler said that it was his idea, and I suspect it was some smart mechanic who put a siren on the airplane, and then everybody took the credit.
German engineers realized that in a near-vertical attack, the Stuka could in theory knock off its own propeller with its bomb. So they came up with a solution, a special bomb cradle.
This cradle, of course, was a breakthrough in design as well, and it actually swung, this bomb represents about a 500-pounder, and it would swing this whole bomb downward, releasing it down here outside of the propeller's arc. So that was important, of course, for accuracy, but also to maintain the safety of keeping it from hitting the propeller.
Right after bomb release, the Stuka would pull up steeply, putting 5 or 6 times the force of gravity on the pilot. At this point, most pilots were suffering from G-induced blackout, but the Stuka was designed to automatically pull out of the dive.
The autopilot would take over and make sure that aircraft pulled out of its dive at about 1,400 feet. Obviously, the pilot would regain his composure and take the aircraft controls back over with the autopilot off.
The Stuka, a formidable strike weapon in Europe, took a terrific beating during the Battle of Britain against RAF fighters. The aircraft's limitations became glaringly apparent.
It was a good bombing platform, but it couldn't defend itself against other airplanes.
This was a shock to the Luftwaffe because up to that point, the Stukas had been absolutely deadly.
When the Nazis had complete air superiority, the Stukas could operate with impunity. Once that air superiority was lost, they were in trouble.
The Royal Air Force thought that going after a Stuka was kind of like kicking a baby seal.
After being shot out of the skies over Britain, the Stuka was re-equipped with large caliber cannons and reassigned to the Russian front with a new role.
The Stuka became a tank killer par excellence, and they could open a tank up like a tin can.
But against Russian tanks, the Stuka was still completely useless without fighter protection. The Ju-87 Stuka stands firm at number 9, and let's face it, this dive bomber was just plain nasty. Number 8 on our list of the greatest ever bombers is the remarkable World War I Italian heavy bomber, the Caproni C-36.
The Caproni is certainly an exemplar of strategic bombing, probably the first, and probably the most effective of its type.
It wasn't beautiful, it certainly wasn't graceful, but it was functional.
It looks so crude and so unusual, but really it was advanced technology for the time.
It's 1915, 12 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, and the Caproni is flying from Italy over the Alps and hitting Austrian targets. With a 23-meter wingspan, it could carry 770 kilograms of bombs on a 640-kilometer return trip. Historically significant, this first-generation bomber was a new weapon, and it fired the imaginations of military thinkers.
The Caproni series of huge airplanes were a startling influence on bombing. No one had built airplanes that big to carry bombs, and Italy was the first to do so, and it had remarkable successes.
The Caproni was surprisingly successful because it could carry a ton of bombs, and generally speaking, it did an awful lot of damage. It was an effective aircraft.
They conducted and made it arguably the most successful strategic air campaign in World War I, and it's largely unknown.
What's also largely unknown is that American pilots flew the Caproni bomber.
They were attached to the Italian Air Force and flew the CA-36s on actual strategic missions. And from that grew the American strategic bombing tradition.
Although the Caproni looks fragile and barely airworthy, it did carry a combat crew of 4, and there was no such thing as a comfortable flight for these men.
Crossing the Alps in winter, exposed cockpits, absolutely appalling. The American pilots came back and described it. They said it was no trim tabs on that airplane, so you had to fly the whole mission with your elbow stuck in your stomach, holding the stick forward with a constant weight on your hand all the time.
Comfort level in the Caproni was atrocious. It was cold, it was windswept. There's nothing good that you could say about the comfort level except when it got you back on the ground.
The airplanes are literally held together by wire, and they're covered in fabric. And the top speed of this airplane is the kind of courage it must have taken to get inside of these airplanes without the safety protection that pilots have now.
Flying at high altitudes in the freezing cold were one thing, but the Caproni was also the opposite of streamlined, making it very, very slow.
The Caproni was not fast. You'd get it up to 80 miles an hour as soon as you could after takeoff, and that was it. It's one of those airplanes that people said tended to antagonize the air rather than pass through it. The drag on one of those things is enormous. So 80 miles an hour was about it.
Although the Caproni looks anachronistic and even peculiar, it was a well-designed aeroplane.
And the Italian Air Force were fond of this bomber, keeping it in service until 1929. So we say goodbye to the Caproni at number 8 on our list of the greatest ever. It had a huge impact on the whole concept of aerial warfare, but with its open cockpit and long missions, it was hell on its crews. The number 7 bomber on our list has the style of an Italian sports car, the no-nonsense approach of German engineering, and the daring-do approach of the British. No surprise, really, because this bomber was a 1979 British, Italian, and German co-production. The Panavia Tornado low-level fast attack bomber.
The brilliant thing about Tornado is you name it, we can take it. From very deep bunkers many miles away to localized troops.
I flew the Tornado in the mid-80s at Bruggen, and it was a phenomenal aeroplane.
It was gobsmackingly impressive. The ride at low level is rock solid.
Designed as a multi-role aircraft, the Tornado is a 2-seat, twin-engine fighter interceptor and a bomber, all rolled into one tight package. Armed with 27mm cannons, the Tornado can also carry some 8,000 kilograms of bombs.
It was a very capable aircraft in terms of the weapon load it could carry and the delivery accuracy of the bombs that it could carry on the aircraft. Very, very capable aeroplane.
Greatest ever met up with Royal Air Force pilot Flight Lieutenant Jim Becks to find out what makes his unique swing-wing Tornado GR4 so special.
As you can see here, it's fully forward in 25 degree. We can actually sweep it back, so it almost clips the ailerons at the back at 67. And as the jet accelerates, then we'll sweep them back so that it can go supersonic.
Swept forward for takeoff and landing and swept back for high speed, the swing wing makes the Tornado versatile, but it comes at a price.
You don't get something for nothing. So a swing wing airplane will be a heavier airplane than an airplane that was designed just for that one fixed configuration.
But the extra weight of the swing wing design isn't a problem for the Tornado. Putting the hammer down is what this jet loves to do.
Close to every pilot's heart is the engines. Tornado GR4 is a very powerful aircraft. She weighs 14 tons just on her own. She can get airborne with 28.5, including fuel.
In other words, the Tornado can carry double its empty weight, and with afterburners is capable of going 2.2 times the speed of sound. Using terrain-following radar, the Tornado is designed to fly hands-free at a blistering 1,100 kilometers per hour at treetop level.
Underneath here are 2 radars. One's a ground mapping radar, and the second one's a terrain-following radar. That one looks outside, analyses the ground, and means the jet can fly itself. And we normally fly at night in cloud at 200 feet, with the pilot with his hands touching the canopy.
The aircraft will fly the mission for you. 100 feet, 600 knots, terrain following, at night, in weather. You have to trust it, of course.
Because the Tornado bomber behaves like a fighter plane, it presents a new wrinkle traditional bomber pilots rarely had to contend with: G-force. So pilots like Jim Beck wear the never-out-of-fashion runway accessory, the G-suit.
So it's pretty much like a tube of toothpaste, and it will squeeze you from the bottom of the suit initially, pushing the blood up through the legs and into your tummy. From your tummy, we squeeze our 6-packs, for most of us, and at that stage, then that keeps the blood up into the head, and that is predominantly where you need to keep it.
The Tornado participated in some of the most dangerous missions of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, specializing in hitting Iraqi airfields.
The Iraqi Air Force had huge airfields that were very difficult to close down, and the Tornado could do it.
In that first week, we lost 5 Tornadoes to anti-aircraft fire, not because it was accurately fired. You know you've got a low-level aircraft coming through, you just open fire straight up.
When you're down that low, a guy with a rifle can shoot at you. That can be very bad luck.
Jim Beck was just a kid during the first Gulf War, but he was over Baghdad the night of the latest aerial light show in 2003. His job was to take out Iraqi SAMs, or surface-to-air missile sites.
I was going against radar systems which were designed to shoot down other aircraft. So we saw 700 cruise missiles go in, and then 1 minute later fired my rockets from about 20 miles away. It was a big moment in my life.
Successful and capable, but the Tornado doesn't really know what it wants to be, a bomber or a fighter.
Depends on how the pilot feels at the time. I mean, they can flip a switch and go fighter if they want, which they'll do in a New York minute if they have to. But really, it was designed as an attack bomber.
All airplanes, Panavia, Tornado included, suffer when they really have more than one role, and in this case it has 4 or 5 roles. And so if you really wanted to have a greater air superiority fighter, you'd trim off some of its other roles and tailor it to that.
In my assessment, it's a better bomber. So as an interceptor, capable airplane. As a fighter, nope, but as a bomber, good airplane. The fighter pilots will kill me for that.
Low and fast and exposed, the Tornado is a jack of all trades, but a true master of none. The highly versatile Panavia Tornado stays in the number 7 slot. Number 6 on our list of the greatest ever, the quintessentially British nuclear bomber and star of the James Bond film Thunderball, the Avro Vulcan.
The Avro Vulcan has a sculptural beauty that's just mind-stopping. You look at the airplane and you think, my God, what a beautiful airplane.
Incredible machine, absolutely incredible. To turn an aircraft as big as that, the sound and the power, awesome.
The Vulcan was a marvelous airplane to show off in. I mean, you know, at air shows and things like that, it was tremendous.
The triangular or delta-winged Vulcan grew out of the RAF's need for a nuclear attack bomber that could go the distance, Moscow and back. First showing off the very fashionable nuclear flash white, the Vulcan went operational in 1960. It could carry 10,000 kilos of nuclear or conventional bombs. That's roughly equivalent to 12 family cars.
The Avro Vulcan was a phenomenon for its age. Here we got a huge delta, pure delta, and is going to operate at 60,000 feet and be a nuclear penetrator against the Soviet Union. That's what it was designed to do. Do that wonderfully well. Wonderfully well.
The Vulcan is powered by 4 Olympus jet engines that put out a total of 36,000 kilos of thrust, giving a maximum speed approximately 0.95 Mach, or 1,000 kilometers an hour. And the Vulcan, or Tin Triangle, also had a reputation for having the agile flying characteristics of a fighter, not a bomber.
The aircraft is very maneuverable, and certainly during its heyday, contemporary fighters just could not outturn it at height. We had an exercise in Australia where they had Mirage aircraft, and we were in a turning battle with a Mirage up around 45,000 feet, and we kept turning and he gave up and went home.
The delta wing configuration of the Vulcan was its most distinctive feature, but it wasn't just for show.
The Vulcan is an appealing aircraft, both aesthetically and from an engineering logical standpoint. The thickness of that wing allows you to house a lot of things inside of it, a lot of crew area, bomb compartments, and so forth.
It has very peculiar characteristics. For example, you can fly a delta wing up to an extremely high angle of attack in the air, and it will still fly straight and level if you've got the power to make it go along.
Just as fashion changes with the times, so did the Vulcan, which got a new role and a new paint job after improved Soviet missile technology meant the bombers were vulnerable at altitude. So it was adapt or die. The Vulcan was now a low-level camouflaged attack bomber.
So at the last minute, you'd come to 500 feet, open the doors, and hit the release button, and the bombs would come off in a stick. Ching, 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 ching.
And even then, you could feel the blast of the bomb hit you as you went past, so it wasn't a good idea to go much lower.
Already on the RAF chopping block in 1982, the Vulcan won a reprieve and its first and only taste of combat during the Falklands War.
Obviously, sending a Vulcan was one very persuasive message, because although they used it to drop a bomb on the runway at Port Stanley, it was a clear message that mainland Argentina was in reach.
It turned out to be a round trip of over 8,000 miles, which at the time was the longest bombing sortie that had ever been attempted.
Flying the Vulcan in combat was stressful enough for the crew, but like many things British, the Vulcan had a class system, which in an emergency meant that in all likelihood only the pilots would survive.
It was an us and them aircraft. The 2 pilots sat on ejection seats. The 3 rear crew sat down the back in a black hole. They could not see out. They were facing to the rear, and they were not on ejection seats. If you got a serious problem at low level, and we did have several aircraft do this, the rear crew were unquestionably going to die.
The Vulcan, as cool as it looks, bows out at number 6 because there just weren't enough ejection seats to go round. And to add insult to injury, the bomber ended its flying career as an aerial tanker. We've seen 5 excellent aircraft, but there are another 5 to go before we find out which is the greatest ever bomber. Up next in the number 5 slot is an aircraft that always impresses with its sheer size and brutish power. The Russian Cold War giant, the Tu-95 Bear nuclear bomber.
It was certainly a cool-looking bird. The Russian airplanes designers always had a great aesthetic. They made pretty airplanes.
Unusual looking, swept wing, yet with turboprops. Very fast, very long range, very high altitude.
It is unquestionably one of the huge icons of the Cold War.
Built by the Tupolev Design Bureau, the Bear was the ultimate symbol of Soviet power. Its massive 51-meter swept wings are impressive, but its coolest feature, 4 turboprop engines turning 8 contra-rotating propellers, which gave this bomber incredible fuel efficiency and range.
A contra-rotating propeller consists of 2 propellers, pretty much right in front of the other, and one goes one way and one turns in the opposite sense. It's mechanically complex, and many contra-rotating propeller projects in the past have failed just because of that, but the Russians got it right, and it's been a reliable system for them.
It's the first swept-wing airplane to have turboprop engines, and the United States toyed with the idea, ran a lot of engineering studies, and could never achieve it. But those big, massive 18-foot counter-rotating props just propel the airplane at near jet speeds over enormous ranges. It was, and it is, a great airplane.
The mighty Bear will be remembered as a key player during the Cold War's cat and mouse games, constantly probing European and North American airspace for weaknesses.
Tremendous capability, and certainly spooked us. It used to come around the North Cape quite a lot and to be intercepted by British fighters. So certainly in the height of the Cold War, quite a formidable aeroplane to be up against.
Many Cold War bombers were marginalized by the intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile. But the Bear, an adaptable creature capable of lifting 46,000 pounds of weapons, was tasked with taking out US Navy aircraft carriers with long-range missiles.
They hung all sorts of stuff on it. So you could put standoff weapons on that thing. If you can stand off and fire weapons, it can be very effective.
Where the Tu-95s were really, really hazardous was when they put missiles on them, and they became essentially carrier group killing aircraft. Very, very difficult to defend against, and a massive threat.
The Bear's contra-rotating propellers may have helped with range and endurance, but the noise.
If Cold War fighter pilots have seen any Russian aeroplane up close and personal, it's likely to have been a Bear. Even through their own bone dome, under the canopy with their own aeroplane noise, they could hear those contra-rotating props from a huge distance away. And once they got up close to take pictures, the thing was deafening.
So noisy, in fact, that the Americans could hear the bomber with underwater listening devices that were meant to track Soviet subs.
I've always loved the Bear. The funny thing about the Bear is that the Navy could track the Bear on SOSUS, the sonar surveillance system that they used. They had the Atlantic Ocean wired like a pinball to track Russian submarines. They could also track the Bear because of a unique frequency harmonic. It came off the big counter-rotating propellers. That really flipped me out when I learned that.
The inimitable Tu-95 Bear stays in the number 5 position because for a bomber, it's just a bit embarrassing when you can be hunted like Red October. Our number 4 choice for greatest ever bombers is the so far invincible American stealth superstar, the B-2 Spirit bomber.
The B-2 is a remarkable example of what the Americans can do. It's technologically brilliant and mind-bogglingly expensive.
With the B-2, the discussion is not how many aircraft do we need to destroy this target. It is how many targets can we destroy with this aircraft.
We can go all the way around the world, drop bombs, and come back home. We can do that quickly, we can do it effectively, and we can do it unnoticed.
It is the most incredibly powerful single weapon system that's ever been constructed. It is an extraordinary beast.
The stealth bomber first saw combat in 1999 when it hit Serbian targets during the Kosovo War. And the B-2 continues to see action in the Gulf and Afghanistan, setting records in the process.
In fact, the longest combat mission in the history of aviation was flown by a B-2 flying from Whiteman Air Force Base. 44 hours. They flew from here to Afghanistan and opened the war. And that's what we do, is we go in first.
And a fold-down bed service for those long flights isn't part of the drill.
There's only room for 2 of us up there. Behind us, there's just kind of a little walkway that the door closes up in, and we usually put a cot down there when we're flying our long durations to be able to sleep in between important events.
Many aspects of this freakish-looking stealth bomber are still top secret. Its top speed is reportedly high subsonic, 900 kilometers an hour, at 11,000 meters, and it can carry 23,000 kilos of bombs.
We can actually take, in this plane by itself, 80 500-pound JDAMs that are all satellite guided. They all have an antenna in the tail. So I could take one B-2 bomber and basically take out 80 targets.
From 1,200 meters, the B-2 can drop a bomb within 3 meters of the target. But this bomber's unique ability to remain unseen by the enemy's air defenses is what it's all about. The B-2 uses complex and ever-changing curves to achieve radar invisibility by deflecting radar signals away and not back to the enemy. The stealth bomber is also covered with radar-absorbent material that soaks up the enemy's radar signals.
Different coatings do different things. Some coatings allow radar energy to be absorbed. Some reflect radar energy.
The unique-looking B-2, with its 52-meter wingspan, is what's known as a flying wing, because it doesn't have a tail like traditional aircraft.
No tail. How many airplanes do you see with no tail? And that requires a lot of computer power, a lot of different flight control functions that we have. But technology is at that state now where that can happen.
Without the computerized stability system, the B-2 bomber would go totally out of control. It relies upon its computers for its stability. So let's hope they have a good computer system that doesn't crash, because if it crashes, the aircraft crashes.
The B-2's flying wing design generates a lot of lift, and that means the pilots need to pay special attention during landing.
The B-2 is different from most any other plane you'll ever fly. There's lots of lift, way too much lift. This plane, you have to fly it down, hold it until you can't stand it anymore, and you just almost fly it right into the ground. And just touch the stick a little bit, and it kisses the ground. It's a really nice airplane. If you flare at all, it'll float down the runway. That's what it does.
Going to war in a stealth bomber may very well be one of the safest ways to hit the enemy, and that's just fine by the politicians and the pilots.
It can go out, it can hit its targets and stand a very good chance of coming back undetected. And in today's world, where there's such a resistance to taking any casualties, that's an enormously important capability.
It's kind of nice to know that you're invisible and that people aren't going to get you. My family feels good about that, I feel good about that, and it makes me feel safe.
The B-2 was first designed to fly nuclear strike missions to the USSR. With the end of the Cold War and deep defense cuts, only 21 of these hyper-expensive bombers have been built. Each B-2 comes with a price tag that's close to $1.2 billion.
No one would buy and build a B-2 today And certainly had the B-2 not already been in production, no one would have continued funding it.
You also have to take into account what it's intended to do. It is a way of projecting power. It's a 21st century gunboat.
Now, the B-2 is designed to keep our country free and safe and make life very hard on our country's enemies. What's that worth? It's worth a lot.
It can go and project power throughout the world. And that's what this airplane's about, is global strike and global power.
Because of the billion-dollar price tag, low production numbers and short combat history, the B-2 comes in at number 4 on our list of the greatest ever bombers. In the number 3 slot, the sharp end of RAF bomber command during World War II, the Avro Lancaster.
If the British public remembered 2 aeroplanes from the war, it's the Spitfire and the Lancaster.
The Lancaster could take a tremendous amount of pounding. It was a fantastic aeroplane.
It was the best Brit bomber of the war. It had an enormous bomb load, so it'll wreck your whole day.
Yeah, the Lancaster must be one of the greatest bombers ever, if not the greatest bomber ever, I would say.
Entering combat in 1942, the 4-engine Lancaster was king of the nighttime raids into Germany. It had a crew of 7 and could carry a heavier load than any other bomber in the European theatre.
Huge bomb bay. Enormous capacity bomb bay. No other aircraft in World War II lifted a single bomb weighing 22,000 pounds, but the Lancaster did.
The Lancaster's 1942 Dambuster raids, one of the most audacious bombing missions in history. The target, German dams in the Ruhr. The Lank carried a massive 4,000-kilo spinning bomb, which could skip on water before exploding against the dam.
The Dambuster raid cost the lives of some of Bomber Command's best aircrew. It was a very expensive mission, but it achieved its objectives, and it did huge damage to the German war economy.
The Lank's ability to lift so many bombs was in large part thanks to her 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Altogether, the Lank's engines could put out some 7,000 horsepower.
Most people by now will have heard of P-51, Mustang flyby. And of course, the Lancaster sounds like 4 of them. So you get this wonderful, it's a sort of educated snarl.
And taking those Merlins flying is what it's all about.
Controls are remarkably well harmonised. It's quite heavy at low speed, as you would expect, but at high speed, at cruising speed, the controls are quite precise, and you can be quite positive with it, and it trims out beautifully, handles very, very well. Lovely aeroplane.
It was really easy to fly. It operated almost like a fighter.
The Lancaster wasn't just a purveyor of death. In the winter of 44-45, the bomber was used to drop emergency food supplies into occupied Holland.
These people in that corner of Holland were starving. We had to drop food. And there were suddenly our bomb bays, instead of being full of bombs, of course, death and destruction, were full of oatmeal, flour, baker's chocolate, big tins. It was quite a feeling. The scenes you saw outside your front windscreen, which were just almost staring at people eyeball to eyeball, were quite dramatic.
The Lank carried a crew of 7 on the dangerous missions over Germany. The tail gunner, or tail end Charlie, was usually the first to get hit during a night fighter attack.
The main thing we had to do was to avoid a conflict with the enemy aircraft, was to get away from it, because they had more powerful guns than we had. First time I saw an enemy aircraft, and I saw it coming in, just called it coming in on a curve of pursuit. We notified the pilot, called him up, and we took evasive action.
But running away from enemy fighters wasn't often an option for the Lancaster. It had a weakness that was heavily exploited by German night fighters. It didn't have a belly turret.
The Lancaster couldn't defend itself. When the Germans attacked the Lancaster, they always came from underneath.
You put upward-firing cannon in the night fighter. He comes in underneath where the bombers can't see him, positions himself a couple of 100 feet below, opens fire, blows the wing off.
Fear is, you can not only feel it, you can taste it. You can say, what does it taste like? It tastes like dry sawdust. And fear itself comes from the back of your neck, right up to the top of your head. You can feel it. You can feel it every time, because these people are very good at their business, and they're trying to kill you.
The total casualty rate for RAF Bomber Command was over 50%, making the chances of surviving a tour of 30 missions unlikely.
If you count all the aircrew that flew with Bomber Command, it's about 120,000 men. 55,000 dead.
After a tour of 30 combat missions, the war was over for most RAF aircrew, but some, like Alfred Hooperman, went back for more.
I volunteered to go back to do a second tour. The adrenaline of being on a bomber station with all the crews, it got into your system. When I look at it, I wonder where all the years have gone. It's 60 years, but it still is a great experience to stand by it. It's nostalgic, very nostalgic.
The Lancaster leaves honorably in the number 3 spot because of a fatal weakness, no belly turret, something the next bomber on our list had from day one. In the number 2 spot on the greatest ever bombers is one of the most recognizable planes of World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress.
Yeah, the B-17 was a Cadillac of the bombers. Beautiful bird, absolutely gorgeous, the B-17.
I love this airplane because you could do an awful lot of damage to a B-17 and it'll still take you back.
With a crew of 10, the B-17 Flying Fortress served in every World War II combat zone, but is best known for daylight strategic bombing of German industrial targets. Cruising at 270 kilometers an hour, its maximum short-range bomb load was 8,000 kilos of iron or dumb bombs.
The US Army Air Force philosophy was that its bombers would fight their way through to the target, and to do that, they had to be heavily armed.
The media dubbed the bomber the Flying Fortress because of its 13 50 caliber machine guns.
As soon as I saw a German plane, I tried to get him in the sight, and if I had him in the sight, all I did was hit the trigger switches. Here comes one in this direction, another direction. Here he comes, Porter, get him, get him.
Hitting a target going that fast with a firearm is not all that easy. Even if you've got 10 50 caliber machine guns, 300 plus mile an hour target is going to be a hard thing to hit.
60 years ago, pilot Ken Hoddenott and ball turret gunner Bud Porter flew the B-17 in combat. Without German fighters and flak to contend with, the greatest ever took them for a flight down memory lane in the Liberty Bell.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It sure is.
You have the controls?
I got him.
Yes, sir. And if you just want to keep a left-hand turn coming around.
Boy, that thing is hard to steer, yeah.
The B-17's toughness was legendary. Losing an engine or a few feet of wing didn't knock it out of the sky.
A shell went through our left wing between 1 and 2 engines. It put a gigantic hole between the 2 engines and threw out oil. I've never experienced vibration like this in my life.
But the B-17 brought back so many with holes in them, vertical stabilizers shot off. Several came back with gunners flying the airplane back after the pilot, co-pilot, and sometimes navigator bombardier who were really exposed up front were blown out. It's a hell of an airplane.
So why could the B-17 take a beating and still manage to make it home?
The B-17 was tough because it just had extra metal. I always said it was sort of like the 1953 Buick philosophy, you know, just make it big, make it heavy.
Just confirms what I've always said, it's the greatest airplane ever built.
You're doing perfect.
Made me feel like I was 21 years old again, really did.
B-17 missions were flown at altitudes of 6,000 meters or more, and that meant dealing with extreme cold.
Over the Class A uniform, we wore an electrically heated suit. And then over the electrically heated suit, fur-lined jackets, pants, boots, etc.
Oh, what a nice day to fly.
Oh, yeah. Every day is.
You know, I'm in a nice air-conditioned cockpit. And
well, we got it once in a while 60 below zero.
Hard to believe.
The B-17 dropped some 500,000 tons of bombs on European targets in daylight raids, but it came at a price. Almost 5,000 B-17s were shot down, with a loss of some 47,000 aircrew.
One time it's an airplane with 10 men, and the next minute it's just a big black puff. It was an experience that was worth $1 million that you wouldn't pay a nickel to do again.
It was only later in the war that the loss rate dropped, thanks in large part to the greatest ever fighter, the long-range bomber escort, the P-51 Mustang, which took on the Luftwaffe fighters.
Remember, we call these B-17s the flying fortress. Fight in, fight out. Well, they got tremendous losses. A Mustang could stay with the B-17s. They could go anywhere the B-17s went and bring them home.
It was a P-51 that really saved us, because then they could fly all the way into the target and all the way back.
So the B-17 stays in the number 2 position of the greatest ever bombers. The bomber just couldn't live up to its nickname, the Flying Fortress, without the help of fighter escort. But for Ken and Bud, flying the B-17 remains a greatest ever experience.
It's a great airplane. Boeing built a super airplane, and in this is special good.
That's probably the greatest thrill I've had since World War II.
Coming up next in the number 1 slot, the greatest ever bomber. Here's a hint. Most of the pilots flying this beast today weren't even born when this bomber entered service. In the number 1 slot of the greatest ever bombers, the undisputed aerial heavyweight champion of the world, the B-52 Stratofortress. First designed to take nuclear Armageddon on a one-way trip to the Soviet Union, this bomber continues to see frontline service in the Gulf and Afghanistan.
The B-52 is not exactly a pretty aircraft, but it gets the job done. We don't necessarily make a lot of movies, but we'll make a lot of history.
It's almost as old as I am. Yeah, I mean, you have grandchildren of the first flight crews who are now flying the airplanes on operational missions.
You may hear the B-52 referred to as the Buff. In our community, that stands for the big, ugly, fat fella. It's a great plane, and I couldn't imagine flying anything else.
Big, ugly, fat fella, indeed. The Buff first flew in 1952 and has been a busy camper ever since. It's carpet-bombed North Vietnam, smashed Iraqi National Guard units in both Gulf Wars, fired cruise missiles at Serbian targets, and dropped bunker-busting bombs on Al-Qaeda positions in Afghanistan. The greatest ever got the inside scoop on the Buff from B-52 combat pilot Brandon Parker.
We're ready, crew. You may hear certain cliches when you're talking about the B-52. Flying artillery may be one of them. If you think about it, we carry a lot of bombs and we're able to orbit on station and provide support to those coalition ground forces for an extended amount of time. And that's a great, great capability for us.
In the 1960s, before most present-day B-52 pilots were born, the B-52 was the Cold War's 24/7, go-anywhere nuclear enforcer.
It was a tremendous deterrent. The Soviet Union couldn't deal with it. Nikita Khrushchev, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, often remarked that in all his decisions, he had to keep in mind that on patrol on his borders were B-52s armed with nuclear weapons, ready to come in at a single moment. And so he thought that over very carefully and backed down.
The B-52 can lift a staggering 31,500 kilograms of mixed weapons, including nuclear and conventional bombs. In weight terms, that's like carrying 40 family cars. The Buff's immensely strong wings not only lift the bomb load, but are filled with fuel to give the bomber its enormous range.
As our gross weight increases, the wingtips actually get lower to the ground. That's why it's important that we have the tip gear out here, because we do carry a lot of the fuel in our wings. When we land, depending on our gross weight, those tip gear will actually hit the ground and start rolling to provide some stability out on the wings.
I imagine some of the older engineers were downright alarmed to see those wings droop when it's sitting on the ground. It just seems so counter to everything that was orthodoxy in aircraft design up to that point. But they did it, and it was successful.
The key to the B-52's success and longevity goes back to its design.
It's because it's a marvelous airframe. It's almost indestructible. It's so big, you can stack all sorts of things in it. Your avionics get out of date, you rip them out and you put a new set in. The engines perhaps could do with some more power. Take them off, put new ones on. They're podded engines, it's easy.
And that plane was not designed to live for 20,000 hours of flight time. The designers and the builders did a really good job putting the airplane together. Just, Mercedes lasts a long time if you maintain it properly. So does the B-52.
From carpet bombing to precision bombing, the B-52 is now carrying out missions it was never originally designed for.
With the more advanced weaponry, we're able to load almost any type of weapon on here, employ that weapon, and support coalition ground forces. And we're actually employing the B-52 in ways that we never dreamed of back at its creation.
However, dropping nuclear bombs is what the Buff was originally designed for, and it was the star of Stanley Kubrick's classic anti-war film, Dr. Strangelove.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
A few B-52 pilots, like Walter Boyne, got to experience an atomic bomb drop during testing.
There's this huge, massive explosion. It turns the Pacific from night to day. I mean, brighter than day. You just can't imagine. And it's not just, a little bit ahead of you or a little bit behind you. It's the whole world. It's just like the night has been destroyed. It's just unbelievable. We have an old navigator on board, Blake White. He said, every head of state should see this. And it's really true. But to experience it, you realize what you're playing with.
The B-52 is the greatest ever bomber, and the Buff's greatest ever achievement is, without a doubt, not dropping a nuke in anger.
Any weapons system is money well spent as long as you never have to use it. In the case of SAC and the B-52s, they never had to drop nuclear weapons on anybody, and that's the definition of winning the Cold War.
When it's all said and done, this B-52 will have performed its mission for almost 80 years. 80 years, no other bomber in history will be able to say that. The greatest ever bomber, the B-52.